Good morning again. My name's Gareth Floyd. I'm Head of Communications for the Global CCS Institute. I hope you're all successfully logged in, and we have a very good subscription to this webinar. We will get going now, and so we'll proceed through the slides. I'm going to be MC, and I'm going to be joined by two of my colleagues. So, the Global Status of CCS is our flagship publication. 2012 is the fourth year that the Global CCS Institute has reported globally on CCS. In this report, we identify the status of CCS, and that includes a comprehensive overview of CCS projects. We report on the developments that have occurred in the past year and the challenges that must be addressed. If you actually haven't seen the report, it can be freely downloaded from the Institute's website at globalccsinstitute.com. And we've got two presenters joining us today, that is Barry Jones and Holger Beitz. So Barry Jones is the Institute's General Manager for Policy and Membership. Barry's got overall responsibility for the Institute's work on CCS economics, policy, legal and regulatory issues, capacity development and member relations. He has an extensive senior executive experience in policy research and delivering business services for several Australian government departments and agencies. He's worked in the fields of energy and resources, climate change, tourism, industry policy and small and medium-sized enterprise issues. Barry's past roles include Head of Enterprise Connect, CEO of Invest Australia and Head of the Bureau of Tourism Research. He's got a Bachelor of Science and Master of Public Policy degrees from the Australian National University. We'll also hear from Holger Beitz, the Institute's General Manager for Projects, Financial and Commercial. Holger is responsible for the Institute's project collaboration activities, including work in the areas of capture, storage and public engagement, and addressing financial and commercial issues faced by CCS projects globally. Prior to joining the Institute, Holger was Head of Regional Business Development with the RWE Group, overseeing business development opportunities in mid-central and southeastern Europe. This involved origination, development, monitoring and completion of a portfolio of large-scale infrastructure projects in the energy sector. Holger's got more than 16 years of worldwide business development experience and extensive knowledge of the energy value chain. Holger has a legal and business management education background and is also a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. A couple of housekeeping matters just before we get started. Please feel free to ask questions during the presentation. You can actually submit the questions using the Questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. These will be moderated and put to Barry and Holger at the end of the presentation. We will do our best to get through as many be recorded and will be made available on our website along with the slides in the next few days. With that, I'll pass you on over to Barry Jones.
Thanks very much for that, Gareth. As you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to present on 7 key messages that we really draw out of this year's Global Status of CCS report, and those key messages are on your screen at the moment. The first is that action is needed now to ensure that CCS can play a vital role in tackling climate change. CCS is already contributing to that effort, but we feel that progress must be accelerated. There is steady progress being made, but there's been important developments over the past year as well that bear thinking about. There is encouraging policy support from a range of governments, but more support is required. There's obviously some barriers that must be overcome to realise the benefits of CCS, and we'll detail those for you. It's also vital that the cost of the technology is reduced, and one of the major ways of doing that is through developing more demonstration projects. And a final and very important lesson is that acceleration of CCS does depend on collaboration and knowledge sharing between all of us, and this webinar is an example of that effort. So if we move to the first key message, which is, as I said, that action is needed now to ensure that CCS can play its role in tackling climate change, This sort of chart will be familiar to many of you. It relates to what is really the critical problem that's been identified over the past decades, which is the rapidly increasing level of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere and a commensurate increase in the temperature of the atmosphere. And of course that temperature is projected to increase to unsustainable levels if nothing is done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, as many of you will be aware, addressing climate change, of course, requires the entire global community to be on board, and it is vital that action is taken now to decarbonise energy consumption wherever possible. No single technology or even class of technologies can achieve that level of decarbonisation, and that's where we think that CCS is a critical component of the answer. If we go to the next slide, we see again a diagram that in many guises has been around for some years now. It's based on work by the International Energy Agency and shows the familiar wedges of the contribution that can be made by different technologies to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If we want to limit global temperature increases to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, then it is important that current levels of greenhouse gas emissions are substantially reduced by the middle of the century. To meet this target, large-scale investments are required across a portfolio of low-carbon technologies, and this chart illustrates that broad-scale portfolio, including the contributions modelled by the International Energy Agency, by energy efficiency, fuel switching, by alternative forms of electricity generation in particular, including renewables, nuclear, but most importantly by CCS. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is a vital component of that low energy technology portfolio and contributes, under this scenario, 14% of the required emission reductions over the entire period to 2050 and 17% of the emission reductions in the year 2050. So CCS in fact has an increasing contribution the further out we go. In the IEA's least cost scenario, which this chart illustrates, CCS would be contributing about 7 gigatons of the total reduction in emissions required by the middle of the century. And work by the IEA also illustrates that if CCS were to be excluded as a technology option in the electricity sector in particular, then investment costs over the period to 2050 in order to meet that emission reduction target would increase by about 40%, or around $3 trillion. So CCS is not only a vital part of the portfolio, it's a very important way of achieving these emission reductions at the lowest cost possible. So, what does that mean for where CCS is now and the pathway we need to get to in order to achieve that level of emission reduction? Well, as we said, the second key message really is that action is needed now to ensure that CCS can play its role. And in this figure, we can see the current and projected volumes of carbon dioxide stored by the existing and currently planned CCS projects around the world. The Institute undertakes the most comprehensive annual global survey of CCS projects. And what we do is focus on what we call large-scale integrated projects. These projects are the ones that are intended to demonstrate the technology at a commercial scale, a utility scale, the sort of thing that would need to be implemented on real-world power plants and industrial plants on a very wide basis. And what is also vital is that a critical mass of those large-scale projects is required in the short term to demonstrate the integrated application of CCS technologies across a range of industries. As you'll hear in a little while, CCS is used in a number of industries today, and what this chart shows is that the bottom bars, the yellow coloured, indicates the amount of CO2 that's stored by currently operating large-scale CCS projects around the world. And by the end of this year, the currently operating CCS projects will be capturing and storing permanently around 23 million tonnes a year of carbon dioxide, a not insignificant figure, and we estimate that figure of abatement is greater than that achieved annually by all other energy-related climate efforts in Australia, and is about on par with the level of abatement being achieved in the UK as well. There's a further 8 projects under construction, and that represents the purplish bars, the second from the bottom. And by 2015, when all of those projects currently under construction are estimated to come on stream, the total amount of CO2 being stored by all of the projects in operation by that time will be around 36 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. That's about 70% of the IEA's target for mitigation activities for CCS by 2015. So a reasonable effort, but already below what the IEA says will be necessary for CCS to play its part. I'll now pass you over to my colleague Holger, and he will go through in some more detail the current status of CCS projects.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks, Gareth, for the introduction at the start. I'm now continuing with the second message with the title here on this figure. CCS is already contributing, but progress must be accelerated. As heard earlier, to maintain the path to the 2 degrees Celsius target, the number of operational projects must increase to around 130 by 2020. And that is needed to happen from the level of 16 currently in operation or under construction. However, as shown in this figure, with 59 projects in the planning stages, there are not sufficient numbers of projects in the pipeline to make reaching the 130 likely in 2020. It is also inevitable that some of these planned projects will not proceed at various stages and points in their development. Including the difficulties in developing new projects, there are delays in climate change legislation. This lack of progress continues to undermine private sector investment in CCS activities, which then impedes technology development. In some industries and areas, such as iron, steel, and cement manufacturing, CCS is the only technology available for the decarbonization. We have only a short window to act now and to extend broad-scale climate policy to support the required technologies. Like all emerging technologies, substantial, timely, and stable policy support, including a carbon price signal, is required for CCS to really become a viable, demonstrated, and deployed technology. This will drive industry confidence in investment ultimately, ensuring continuing innovation and reducing capital and operating costs. The ramp-up to achieve the needed mitigation by CCS of 7 gigatons of CO2 in the year 2050 that Barry mentioned is enormous. This is over 300 times what is currently being stored. Apart from the 8 operating projects around the world, an important development in the last year is that there are now 2 more projects in the execute stage. This means that final investment decision has been taken by those projects and they are now under construction. These additional projects are Quest in Canada and Lost Cabin in the US. Looking a bit more closely at the next set of projects, it is encouraging to see that these projects under construction now cover a range of industries. Specifically, as mentioned before, 2 power generation plants, the Kemper County IGCC in the US and Boundary Dam in Canada. 2 natural gas plants, Gorgon in Australia and Lost Cabin again in the US. 2 hydrogen production facilities, Quest and Air Products. 1 fertilizer plant, Agrium with ACTL, and 1 ethanol plant, ADM's Illinois ICCS project. Most projects have received significant government support, including direct grants and/or tax credits. Apart from the power projects, the capture costs for these projects are relatively low. 4 of the projects are in the United States, 3 are in Canada, and 1 is in Australia. Enhanced oil field recovery will feature in 5 of these projects. The project data that we use in our global status of CCS reports comes from the annual survey of large-scale integrated projects, or LSIPs, that the Global CCS Institute conducts. The 2012 project survey identified 75 LSIPs with a geographical distribution as shown here. Note the concentration of projects in China now, as well as Europe and North America. Coming back to the key messages from the beginning. Here, the key message number 3, steady progress but important developments. It is clear that a very substantial increase in new projects needs to occur if the IEA scenario for CCS is to be met. At the current total of 75, the net number of large-scale integrated projects has had a net increase of only 1 project since 2011. Since 2010, one of the key project developments that we have seen is the steady increase of projects at the execute stage, as you can see in this figure. That these projects have been able to make a positive final investment decision gives confidence for CCS business cases. What is somewhat alarming is that we are not seeing the same steady improvements in the latter stages of development planning, being the define and evaluate stages. Amongst the changes within the set of projects from 2011 to 2012 is that 8 previously identified projects were cancelled, put on hold, or restructured for diverse reasons. Those reasons ranging from insufficient revenues for carbon sales to inadequate storage regulations. These cancelled, put on hold, or restructured projects were offset by 9 newly identified projects, and of these, 5 are in China. Progress of CCS in China continues to be strong, and the Institute is now very pleased to have a locally based representative in China. This will allow us to strengthen our engagement there and to work more closely with our Chinese members and stakeholders. The uptake of CCS in developing countries is key to seeing CCS fulfill its full emission reduction potential. After all, to achieve global emission reduction targets, 70% of CCS deployment will need to occur in non-OECD countries by 2050. In this respect, it is encouraging to see that at least 19 developing countries are engaged in CCS-related activities, mostly at the early stages. This figure shows us the spread across storage types for the large-scale integrated projects around the world. In the short to medium term, CO2 EOR is taking a larger role in the current suite of projects, with now over half of the large-scale integrated projects having CO2 EOR as their primary storage option, an increase by 5% since 2011. As an additional important source of revenue, CO2 EOR has become a strong driver supporting projects, particularly in North America, China, and the Middle East. Importantly, all of the newly identified projects in China are investigating the use of CO2 EOR. The spike of new projects in China means that China now has the 3rd highest potential to store CO2 through CCS projects. Nevertheless, current assessments on the potential of EOR and also depleted oil and gas fields strongly suggest that deep saline formations will provide the bulk of storage in the long term. We believe that CO2 EOR can be considered a CCS project if it can demonstrate that permanent storage of injected anthropogenic CO2 is associated with the EOR operations. In this regard, policy and regulations must encourage the transition of CO2 EOR to dedicated storage and should provide clear guidance on least cost monitoring and reporting requirements. And with these words, we'll now pass back to you, Barry, to talk about developments in the policy space.
Thanks very much for that, Holger. Just as we've seen steady progress in the projects front over the past year, so we've also seen some progress in policy support for CCS. Very notably, CCS was accepted into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Clean Development Mechanism at the end of last year, and that marks a very important development in the acceptance of CCS as a mitigation option in United Nations frameworks. And as well as the CDM, there's a range of other UNFCCC mechanisms in which CCS may play its part, and for which the Institute in particular will be making sure that the UNFCCC regulators do take account of CCS and all of those other mechanisms as well. Inclusion in the CDM enhances the international recognition of CCS, but also makes sure that project developers can now move to develop the modalities, the procedures, the institutional arrangements needed to support their CCS projects, and that development of methodologies is going to be an important further development in the course of the next couple of years. But as well as the international arena, we've also seen some pleasing progress in a number of individual countries. In the United Kingdom, their comprehensive look at electricity market reform and the role of CCS in the electricity markets is a very important development that's going to require some watching. In China, CCS has been included into China's 12th five-year plan, and what that means is that there will be concrete steps taken in China to accelerate even further the progress of CCS in that country. China already has a number of pilot and smaller scale CCS projects operating today, but inclusion of CCS into various elements of the 12th five-year plan really paves the way for the development of larger scale projects in China. And of course in Australia, the Australian government also introduced a carbon tax in 2012, which will transition to an emissions trading scheme in 2015. That emissions trading scheme will be linked to the European Union's emission trading scheme. And again, that's an important milestone on the way to introducing carbon pricing, which is a very important development. But it's vital that more progress is made towards reducing emissions, not only in those countries already mentioned, but in a wide range of other countries as well, because it's obvious that more work needs to be done to achieve the kind of radical technological change that's required to decarbonise the energy system. And in support of that, governments need to put in place the necessary regulatory infrastructure to support all of that. So, as we've said, at an individual level, the UK is taking a very important role in direct support for CCS. It is implementing policies that are intended to drive CCS deployment beyond demonstration projects, as well as rejigging their support mechanisms for the first round of demonstration projects. In Europe, it is clear from our survey that CCS projects in Europe strongly indicate that government policy is essential for projects to be in a position to make a positive business case in that continent. And it is positive that the NER 300 funding program in Europe is progressing, and we are very much aware that many projects are eagerly awaiting the announcement of decisions on that funding process in the near future. Once again, on the international front, there are a couple of international conventions or protocols which are also important for the storage and transport of CO2. One of those is the OSPAR Convention, which is the Convention for the Protection of the Marine Environment of the Northeast Atlantic. That's important for those countries in the Northeast Atlantic region planning to transport and store CO2 offshore, and it's very pleasing that full ratification of that convention has now been achieved. But another important international mechanism is the London Protocol, which allows for the export of carbon dioxide for storage in offshore geological formations. Amendments to the protocol to allow for that were agreed by nations some time ago, but really more work needs to be done in order to ratify that convention, and we urge nations around the world really to take the action necessary in order to ratify that convention and get their work underway. Another important development is the work now being done to develop international standards for carbon capture and storage through the International Standards Organisation. A technical committee has been formed in that regard. It's already had one meeting. Its second meeting is scheduled for February next year. The development of those standards is going to take some time, but it's going to be very important, we think, over the next few years for the CCS community to fully participate in that standards development process, and to make sure that the standards are not only the highest quality that can be achieved, but also achievable by the industry. Another key message from us is that among the barriers that have to be overcome to realise the benefits of CCS is to bring the costs of CCS technologies down. This figure shows the relative cost of CCS in terms of avoiding CO2 emissions compared to a range of other electricity generation technologies. And what it clearly shows is that CCS is a cost-competitive technology compared to a range of other CO2 mitigation options. Clearly, CCS does add costs to existing power generation, but if the aim is to reduce CO2 emissions, then the range of options available do include some very high cost options, which are much higher in cost than CCS at the present time. It's vital to bring the costs of all of those technologies down through research, development and further demonstration. And really a key message is that CCS should not be disadvantaged in that effort to drive the costs down the chain. Difficulties certainly currently arise because CCS is not treated equivalently to other low-carbon technologies in policy settings or government support. And it's important that CCS is not disadvantaged in that way, and that policies don't discourage CCS as a mitigation option, given the potential that it can play and given the potential for significant cost reductions that are also in train. It's also important, though, that we move to address other barriers that are facing CCS as well. And in our status report, we go through in some detail what those other barriers may be and what needs to be done to overcome them. Clearly, storage site selection and characterisation is a lengthy and costly process, and it's important to do storage work on projects upfront and very early in the process. That's a lesson that's been learned from projects around the world. The majority of perceived risks in CCS projects is associated with the storage stage, so it is important that project developers realise that putting early and intensive effort into proving up their storage options is very important. But it's also obvious that public understanding of CCS remains low right around the world, and more work is needed to be done to explain CCS to the general public and to policymakers, to explain what the technology means, how it can play its part in emissions reductions, but also the safety considerations around CCS. There are many myths around what CO2 is and what it does when injected underground. We have operational experience from large-scale projects that needs to be translated into the public sphere to explain the potential of CCS. And those public engagement activities must also be designed to build and reinforce trust with key stakeholders. And of course, as already demonstrated, we need to bring down the costs of CO2 capture, and in particular through technology developments and demonstration. It's the capture stage that has the greatest potential for cost reductions and is also the greatest contributor to the costs of CCS. And it's very important that we do further work in the research and development phase to keep driving down the costs of that stage of the chain. And with that, I'll pass back to Holger to conclude the presentation.
Thanks, Barry. And from barriers to notable highlights in the last year, it's firstly worthwhile mentioning that in Norway and Canada, 2 events this year really demonstrated the benefits of public and private sector support in advancing cost-effective technologies. In Canada, it was an exciting development to see the Quest project being announced last month, that it will move forward and capture and store more than 1 million tons of CO2 per year produced at the Athabasca Oil Sands project. This came just on time to be included as one of the executing projects in our this year's Global Status Report. It is also very encouraging that Quest will be storing CO2 in deep saline formations, although they say they are also CO2 EOR ready. In Norway, the $1 billion technology center Mongstad was opened in August and is now an industrial-scale test center for carbon capture technologies. This marks an important milestone in research, development and demonstration, and should demonstrate that the potential for CCS costs to be significantly reduced over time is available. The knowledge generated by both of these facilities will drive innovation around the world. It's further noteworthy that power generation has yet to be demonstrated at scale. In that respect, it was very promising when Southern Company's post-combustion plant Barry in the US recently became the world's largest operating at 25 megawatts operating integrated CCS project at a coal-fired power plant earlier this year. Going forward, commercial scale demonstration of capture requires application at increasing scales, with integration into complicated industrial processes or power stations. As mentioned earlier, it is very promising that there are now 2 large-scale demonstration power generation projects under construction, with both scheduled to begin operation in 2014. These are, as mentioned before, Kemper County in the US and Boundary Dam in Canada. These early commercial scale demonstration projects will identify construction and operating problems through learning by doing. Reducing the cost of technology through demonstration projects is vital. While the net number of planned power generation LSIPs has remained constant since 2010, we can see in this figure that there has been a marked decrease in CO2 capture capacity in the power generation sector. One of the reasons this has occurred is that we have seen a number of more advanced projects with larger CO2 capture capacity being cancelled or put on hold. It's just much more complicated to bring together the business cases for this higher cost capture undertakings. These projects are partly being replaced with smaller and earlier stage projects. Projects still being planned and potential new projects will be able to learn from these projects that are not going forward. As there are realizations that the costs for these larger power projects are currently too great, projects are able to reduce their financial liabilities by going forward with a relatively smaller outlay, or try to improve their business cases by polygeneration concepts. However, strong near potential for CCS exists in industries with the lowest additional cost of capture, such as natural gas extraction, fertilizer, synfuels, and ethanol production, or, as mentioned before, projects that undertake polygeneration activities. One of the largest challenges that remain is CCS in the iron and steel and cement manufacturing industries, where considerable work is still needed to encourage capture demonstrations and CCS technology developments. There are currently no LSIPs being planned in the cement industry. Coming to some recommendations for decision makers that we have derived in our this year's report. Climate change legislation must not be delayed. Timely and stable policy support is essential to deal with the barriers to implementation of CCS. This will drive industry confidence, encouraging more innovation and ultimately reducing capital and operating costs. To achieve emission reductions in the most efficient and effective way, governments should ensure that CCS is not disadvantaged. They must review their policies to ensure that CCS can play a full part in the portfolio of low-carbon technologies. Further, funding for CCS demonstration projects by governments and industry should be accelerated to develop the technology and ultimately bring down costs through innovation. The cornerstone for this is sharing expertise and learning from CCS projects around the world. This must be encouraged to ensure that progress is made as quickly as possible. Creating a business case and managing the technology is a complex and difficult process. So capturing and using lessons from other projects is vital. This knowledge must be shared with developing countries where 70% of CCS deployment must occur by 2050. With these words, I would like to hand back to Gareth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holger, and thanks, Barry, for a very interesting presentation. I'd like now to open up the session for questions and invite people to submit their questions through the GoToWebinar control panel, so please do so. Just to get things started, I'd like to ask some questions to get us into the right space. So, noting that we've got to move quickly, where do you expect to see the greatest developments in the coming year? And I'm going to put that question to Holger, please.
Coming just back from the PCC conference in North America, I would like to highlight two areas where presumably the most progress will take place. Although a couple of projects in the US are moving forward, driven by CO2, EOR, and polygeneration revenue streams, I would predict that the most progress that we are going to see is possibly also happening in China. China has become a sort of powerhouse for CCS technology development, again starting more with the lower cost coal-to-chemicals and coal-to-liquids undertakings, but also driven by CO2, EOR in China and various basins in China. So I would predict that CCS projects in particular in China will see quite some developments in the coming year.
Thanks, Holger. And then one for Barry here. What should we be looking for in terms of movement in the international arena, and what might you expect?
Thanks, Gareth. The UNFCCC process remains an important one for CCS. So as I mentioned during the presentation, CCS has now been included into the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, but there are a couple of issues remaining to be resolved around that inclusion. So we expect those issues to be discussed again in Doha at COP18 at the end of this year and into next year. It's also important that projects now start to look at how to get their projects underway under the Clean Development Mechanism, and starting to submit methodologies for consideration will be important as well. As I mentioned, other important developments in the international arena relating to CCS include what's happening with the other international funding mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund. Those mechanisms continue to progress, and decisions are being made about where the fund's headquarters are going to be located, how the funds are going to operate. It's important to start mobilising finance into those international financing mechanisms as well. So,
now carry on, sorry.
no, that's right.
We've got a related question here from Jane Burton. She's asking, what's the current status of CCS projects under the Clean Energy Initiative? CCS Flagships, she says. I think that question might be Australian in focus.
If it relates to Australia, then the CCS Flagships program, for those not familiar with the Australian situation, is the Australian government's demonstration funding program for CCS projects. Around 1.6 billion Australian dollars is available for CCS projects under that Flagships program. So far, the money has been allocated to a number of potential projects in Australia. And at the moment, the funding is being allocated in the order of tens of millions of dollars for storage characterisation and assessment work in particular, for the Carbon Net project in Victoria and the Southwest Hub project in Western Australia. So the Australian government has taken basically a deliberate decision to allocate money first to prove up storage, and then progress through the CCS chain.
Excellent. And a question here for Holger from Varun Mehra. What are the upcoming CCS technologies beyond conventional amine or ammonia-based CCS technologies that are worth keeping an eye on?
Clearly, a couple of R&D activities are underway that are going beyond the amines and various types of amines that are currently being trialed and also demonstrated in various projects around the world. Key technologies that may take off again in a couple of, I would say, 5 to 10 years that are currently in the research and development stages are including the so-called modular frameworks. Just give me a sec to look that up precisely.
Are you okay with that, Holger? Or
yeah, give me just a minute, and possibly I'll come back to you in a minute after the next question.
Well, perhaps I'll just put another question to Barry from Michael Butler. Most of the CCS projects are based upon drivers for resource utilisation. So besides the UK, are there other jurisdictions driving CCS for power generation?
Gareth, I missed the beginning of that question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. The beginning of the question it's from Michael Butler. He says that most CCS projects are based on drivers for resource utilisation, but besides the UK, which you mentioned, are there other jurisdictions driving CCS for power generation?
There certainly are. So as some of the slides illustrated, CCS is being planned across a wide range of industries. I think we've seen that the early movers, if you like, tend not to be in the power generation sector, but that's because there are very low-cost capture opportunities available outside of the power generation industry. So, for example, in industries like natural gas processing, the CO2 has to be stripped out of the natural gas stream anyway as part of normal operations. So there's no additional capture costs, if you like. So it's not surprising that the early movers have been outside of power generation. But governments are clearly focused on the importance of power generation and the importance of applying CCS to power generation in the medium term. So we're seeing a range of policy initiatives being considered. There are emission performance standards, for example, being mooted in places like Canada and some jurisdictions in Europe. In Australia, we're relying more on carbon taxes, carbon pricing, with the government here moving away from imposing CCS-ready requirements on power stations. In North America, it very much depends on regional circumstances and whether power stations are operating in a regulated market or not, as to whether they can recover some of the increased costs of capture. So there's a range of things being done around the world, and there's no easy answer to the question. But governments certainly have power generation in their sights, and are certainly looking at ways to enable CCS in the power generation sector.
And there's another question which is related, Barry, from Alan Baker. He notices that projects joining the execution phase seem mainly to be EOR-based, which we mentioned. He says, is pure CCS actually viable in terms of the economics?
Clearly, it is difficult for pure CCS, to use Alan's term. That's why EOR is becoming important, because it provides a revenue source, or an additional revenue source for projects. It is obvious that at this stage of the development of CCS as a technology, large amounts of government support are required in order to get CCS projects over the line. And the projects that are successfully reaching an FID are those which have either got very large amounts of government support or government incentives by way of carbon taxes. For example, in Norway, the operating projects are largely incentivised by a significant carbon tax there. Or by trying to sell the CO2, not just for EOR, but in the case of a couple of projects looking at poly generation, looking at using the CO2 for a number of different sources. An important message coming out of the status report this year is that we recognise that CCS is an expensive technology. We recognise that significant levels of government support are required. But it's important to recognise also that some of the alternative generation technologies, including renewables, also require large amounts of government support to get over the line. So that's why we're saying don't disadvantage CCS in those policy arrangements. Make sure that CCS can also play its part alongside renewables in meeting the emission reduction targets at least cost.
Excellent. And just going back to Holger, did you want to come in on that question around technologies outside amines and so on?
Yes, please. I can definitely say that the current research in the key adsorption-based post-combustion research and development is related to efforts to reduce the parasitic load and energy required to release the CO2 from the solvent. And in this regard, there's a couple of R&D activities underway to really investigate novel chemistries in particular, or also use of naturally occurring enzymes to increase the reaction pace. All of this is R&D, and we apply in our research on the status of R&D a sort of technology readiness level analysis that ranges really from technologies that are at the beginning of their commercial scale development path up to really technologies that are readily available for commercial use, and the technologies that I just referred to are in the early stages. Other work is related and I think has received some press recognition recently. For example, the metal organic frameworks, where really adsorption is the technology that is going forward. Clearly also other technologies are being currently further developed. The chilled ammonia process is still being developed by Alstom and taking the next steps also at the Technology Center Mongstedt that I referred to earlier. I would definitely be willing to answer further questions or help you with any further interest in that area. Thank you.
Thanks, Holger. And another question which we've heard a bit about over the last couple of months. Chris Dalton says, is the media driving community doubts about the safety of CO2 storage, and how should we be addressing that between us? Any comments on that, Holger?
Well, safety is definitely one of the themes that is often picked up by the media, and the perceived risks are always related to storage. And clearly the Institute sees one of its tasks to really articulate what the risks are that are related to storage, and also to transport of CO2 to storage sites. What are the risks related to that? And we have already published a couple of reports and pieces of analysis that deal with that, and will definitely carry on with that, really addressing the safety and risks in the public is one cornerstone of raising the public acceptance and awareness for CCS.
Thanks. And one for Barry, I think. Bradley Kelly says, do you actually see environmental organisations putting forth significant effort against CCS, and if so, what should we be doing about that? So, Barry.
Look, I think there is a range of views in the environmental community around CCS. There are some environmental NGOs who are clearly opposed to CCS in any form and see it simply as prolonging the use of fossil fuels and won't have a bar of it. But there are other environmental NGOs and a significant number of environmental NGOs who recognise that CCS does have a role to play in meeting emission reduction targets, and for a couple of reasons. I think they recognise, for example, that in industrial sectors like iron and steel and cement, there are at the moment very few alternatives to CCS in terms of large-scale emission reductions from those sectors. There are alternatives in the power generation sector, but there are not alternatives in some other industrial sectors. They also recognise the potential of CCS for so-called negative emissions. That is, if you combine CCS with biofuels as the feedstock, you can effectively not only prevent emissions from getting to the atmosphere, but reduce the level of emissions in the atmosphere by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it underground. So some environmental NGOs do recognise the benefits of CCS, if not for all applications, then certainly for some applications. And certainly as an institute, we are working with environmental NGOs across that full spectrum. We're happy to engage with NGOs who have any kind of view on CCS, but it's pleasing that at least some of the environmental NGO community does recognise the significant role for CCS in the future.
Thanks. And for Holger, from Bryce Freeman, who's asking for capture on power plants, to what extent have you observed a shift from coal-fired power plants to natural gas combined cycle plant applications?
I think this is a development that is just emerging. The content of CO2 in the flue gas of gas-fired power plants is significantly lower than those in coal-fired power plants, and this implies that you have to employ technologies that are much more costly, processes that are much more costly. I would say that CCS on gas-fired power plants is just emerging, but needs to take place in the long run to really decarbonize and help to decarbonize the power generation sector.
Okay, we're getting towards the end, so I've got one here from Jean-Paul Tetreault. For Barry, I think the low price of natural gas has prompted fuel switching from coal in thermal generation in preference to coal CCS. and I believed hampered progress for CCS here. Is the situation the same in Europe, Asia? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah, I think you used the word coal too many times there, Gareth.
Yes, yeah. I think the issue is that Jean-Paul is commenting on is the low price of natural gas, actually meaning there's been quite a lot of fuel switching from coal in thermal
to gas. Yeah,
that's right. And
yes, and that's not a phenomenon that's just confined to North America, where it's most pronounced. We are seeing a switch to gas in other jurisdictions as well. So we're seeing it in Australia. We're seeing increasing interest, I guess, in gas in places like China. So look, it is a factor. One of the messages I think for the CCS community is that in the long run, switching to gas will not achieve the kind of emission reductions that are required. So, even if there is a large-scale switch from coal to gas, then it will still be necessary to apply CCS to gas eventually. But I think another important point is that in some large countries like China and India, while there might be some switching from coal to gas, that there will still be very significant coal use into the foreseeable future. So it will still be very important to apply CCS to their coal-based industry and coal-fired power generation, because any switching to natural gas will be at the margins in those countries.
Yeah. Look, I think we're pretty much at our time here, so we didn't get through all of the questions, but I'd like to thank everyone for putting those questions through. It's always difficult to get through them in the allowed time, but if you still have questions, please submit them to us here at the Institute through the webinar inbox. That's webinar@globalccsinstitute.com. A quick reminder that the webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website in the next few days, along with the slides that we've just used. Lastly, as you're leaving this session today, we've put together a quick 3-question survey, and we'd really appreciate you taking the time to complete them, because we always want to improve our webinar program, and that's how we can do so. And also, of course, the status report more generally. Note, we're going to add a question to the online survey to get feedback on the status report too. And also, please remember that the status report is available free of charge for download on our website, and it's been put in a form that you can actually get to the chapters. You don't have to download the whole report if that's not what you're interested in. There's also an executive summary which summarizes much of what we've gone through here. I hope you found this webinar valuable, and once again, thank you very much for attending. Thank you to our two presenters, Holger and Barry. Thank you very much for your attendance, and goodbye. Thank you.